Okay.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. My name's Philomena Horsley. I'm a Sisters in Crime member. I'm a coordinating judge for the 22nd David Awards, which are the Sisters in Crime Awards for the best crime books by an Australian woman. I'm also a social researcher, and I was an expert witness to both the State Government Royal Commission into Family Violence and also the Federal Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse. So I have a particular interest in the themes of the books we're talking about tonight. So Sisters in Crime Australia is very pleased to invite you all to this session, Seizing Justice. We're hoping it will be our last Zoom event due to the pandemic. Silver lining is we've had lots of people able to join from different states and internationally. So greetings to anyone from out of state and international. At the outset, I want to do an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So tonight we're speaking to three eminent crime writers, Jane Caro, Debra Oswald and Nina Campbell, and each of their really interesting and well-written books explores the questions: what happens when women decide to exact justice themselves, when the justice system just doesn't deliver? And killing bad men, is this an acceptable form of justice? So we'll be talking for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a draw at the end of the session for the three $150 crime book packs generously provided by the Sun Bookshop. Now, let me introduce our esteemed panel. So we have Debra Oswald. She's a Sydney-based writer and performer, and she's won 2 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards and was creator of and head writer for the very popular series Offspring, series 1 to 5. She's also written stage plays that have been performed internationally and a swag of novels for young audiences, and most recently the adult novel, The Family Doctor. You can see that one. I'm holding that one up, which we'll be discussing tonight. Debra presented the 21 last year David Awards. So welcome, Debra.
Thank you, Philomena. Hello, everybody.
Jane Caro is well known to many of you. She's an Walkley Award-winning Australian columnist, author, novelist, broadcaster, advertising writer, documentary maker, feminist and social commentator. She does not like to be pigeonholed at all. She appears frequently on our TV screens and discussion programs such as Q&A, The Drum, which I love, and Sunrise, and she hails from Sydney. Her book has just very recently come out. The Mother is her first novel for adults and her first foray into crime fiction. And third, Nina Campbell. She studied theatre and literature at university and worked as a professional writer before a midlife health challenge changed her priorities. Nina now writes full-time fiction in Adelaide with a focus on stories about strong, whoops, right way up.
No, it's not the other way.
It's just reversed on the screen. Daughters of Eve, which is officially launched in a few days. Is that right, Nina?
Yeah. That's right, Tuesday the 29th.
So
hi, everyone.
It's the book none of the audience will have had a chance to read yet, but you can rush into the bookshops within a few days for that. Okay, welcome to everybody here tonight. So we've got 3 authors with a lot to say, so let's crack on. So I'm just going to ask each of you to really briefly introduce the plot or the focus of your book to the audience. So if we start with you, Nina.
Okay, very briefly, Daughters of Eve is a fast-paced police procedural that delves into the murky waters of gendered violence. The story centres on Amelia Hart, who's a gutsy middle-aged detective, and her career-making case, which turns from a high-profile shooting to a serial killer case to an all-out war of the sexes, spearheaded by the vigilante killers, the Daughters of Eve. The book explores the public outrage and the political response to the idea of vigilante women who have their own escalating male body count. It's told from the perspective of the police, who are often caught in the middle.
Okay, and I would say of all the three books, there's more killers in Nina's book than the other two, nevertheless.
Definitely more deaths, big body count.
So Jane, could you introduce us to your book?
Yes, briefly, The Mother is the story of a woman in her late 50s at the beginning of the book and in her 70s at the end. She's a mother and a grandmother, and she thinks her life's going well. And in my experience, that's just the moment when it stops going well. And so first her husband dies suddenly, her daughter marries, she thinks that's great, but it turns out not to be great at all. And eventually she discovers that her youngest daughter has in fact been the victim of ongoing brutal coercive control, and the daughter escapes, comes home to her mother with her two now very small children, and Miriam, the heroine of the book, the mother of the title, the grandmother, finds herself in a world that she never ever ever imagined she would occupy, and slowly begins to realize that all her middle class preconceptions about the law and justice and how they would protect her and her daughter from an obsessed and possibly homicidal man were wrong. And in the end, she has to make a terrible decision about what to do to save her daughter and her grandchildren.
And the tension really builds in relation to that. Deborah, let us hear about your book.
Well, The Family Doctor centres on Paula, who's a sort of beloved, dedicated GP, who comes home one day to find that her dear friend and the dear friend's children have been shot dead by the estranged husband, who then shoots himself in front of Paula. And Paula, in her grief, becomes seized with the idea that she must protect other women and children from that kind of violence. And, as a doctor, her job is to look after people. Her job is to fix people and keep them safe. So in the context of this stress, she contemplates using her medical skills to solve a problem. And the other main character is her best friend, Anita, who is a part of this trio of women, one of whom has been killed. And Anita is a journalist who covers the criminal courts and has seen case after case of women killed and men getting away with it. So it's really about the friendship between those two women and how the two of them approach this problem, and how Anita will approach the shock of finding out what her, friend Paula, who's a good person, a sort of solid, upstanding citizen, has been pushed to do.
Oh, thank you. And one of the things I loved about your book was the strength of the friendship, and I think that's a lovely aspect. Okay, so we've got all of the summaries of the books. People may have read Deborah's because it's been out for a while, but the other two are very new blocks on the book, on the street. Jane and Deborah, I wanted to start particularly with a question to the two of you. So both your books have a focus on intimate partner violence and the different forms of violence men perpetrate against their partners. How did you plan to make this kind of story readable rather than off-putting to the reader? Because it's a very strong theme, clearly, but it's difficult, isn't it?
Well, for me, I think it was because I actually do it through the eyes of the mother of the woman who is being abused, rather than through the eyes of the woman who's being abused. So we don't know anything that Miriam doesn't know. And so I think that gives us a sort of distance. I mean, there's already the distance that this is a book that you're reading. Then we have a person who's telling you the story of what is happening to others. And I think in a way you almost, or I certainly felt, because I knew this was going to go to very dark places, that we needed that little bit of distance perhaps, and in a way Miriam is us, because we've all seen these headlines where a wife and or partner and children have been horribly killed by their supposed loving partner and father who then kills themselves. We've all seen those headlines far too often. And so we watch from a distance, we watch it unfold in the news. And I guess that's exactly how we experience it via the novel. It's more intimate because Miriam is, of course, deeply engaged in this, because this is her child and these are her grandchildren who are living in direct danger from this man. So I hope, if the novel is successful, experience what Miriam feels and thinks as she sees this unfold.
Okay. Debra?
So similarly to Jane, I'm not writing from the point of view of a victim. I'm writing from the point of view of the anguished observer, which is what all of us are when we read those stories. I mean, and again, like Jane, from the point of view of an anguished observer who has particular emotional connection to some of the victims. But I think when I first considered writing in this territory, I didn't know how to write about it in a way that would not just be unbearable. And it was only when I thought about the image of a doctor looking after a little child was the trigger, my own sister being a GP, who has never killed anyone.
But you know of.
But I think it was only when I thought of a way I could grab positive forces and harness them to tell the story. So it's about friendship, and it's about the urge to protect people in a good way. And in the world of the book, there are things like there's a love story in the book, not as a kind of frothy add-on, but because it was important for me to say, in the world, there are terrible men who do terrible things, but there's also good men who know how to, form a relationship with respect and tenderness and extraordinary sexy power. That it was only when I could imagine a world with all those good forces in it too that I could bear to kind of dive into what is distressing and ugly and scary to even imagine, let alone live through.
Thanks. And Nina, in terms of your book, it's slightly different in some ways, although it shares many of those themes, because you've got to focus on past experiences of sexual violence, both in terms of adult women and in terms of children, in terms of sex trafficking of children and the pornography industry. Can you share the thoughts around your approach on writing characters who are living with that scar tissue of those experiences?
Sure. I think I was a women's officer at university the first time somebody told me about their experiences of sexual violence, and it's not something that I was really prepared for at the time. And certainly through my life, even before Me Too, I heard a lot of stories that were very distressing. And of course, we've all read them in the newspapers. And you see those statistics on a regular basis about 1/3 of women who've experienced sexual violence, and those are just numbers. They don't mean anything. And I really wanted to explore what it took for somebody who had been through those kinds of experiences not to buckle underneath them, but to actually go on, because they do. Women live these amazing lives. We have families, we have jobs, high-powered careers, we start businesses, we do all these things, often carrying this wealth of pain and shame that doesn't belong to us. And I think I just really wanted to look at a little bit closer at what it was like, particularly, women in the police force carrying that kind of vicarious trauma on top of their personal trauma, and just really kind of big up women for the way that we handle all of that, and we don't go out and commit mass murder.
And just leading on from that, often, crime books do have a focus on the victim story, but in all of your books, all three of you, you're exploring the ripple effect or the vicarious trauma, as you mentioned, Nina, the impact of violence on those who are related or professionally involved. So we've got GPs, we've got police officers, we've got journalists, friends and family victims. Can you each say something about the importance of that perspective in books? Who wants to start?
Well, for me, I think the core of this book is actually about family relationships and the love between mother and children and grandchildren, and how complex that can be, how shot through with guilt and misunderstanding and nervousness and timidity. And then, you know, Miriam's always convinced right from the beginning that whenever she tries to get closer to Alison, with whom she has a scratchy relationship, and Alison, of course, is the abused daughter in the end, she always feels she has this uncanny ability to say the wrong thing. And so it's not just about the darkest places that relationships can go. It's also about the ordinary, everyday, messy things that happen in relationships. And I think at the end, it's actually about redemption, and it's about how relationships and love and, you know, family really can survive even the most extreme and appalling circumstances and situations. So I think, like all three of the books, it's actually about the resilience, the strength, and the indomitability of women and their love for the people in their lives, be they family members, friends, or colleagues.
Deborah and Nina, do you want to add? Because both of your books really take us to the challenge of living with this constant exposure, whether it's deeply personal or whether it's in the role of the professions.
Yeah, so in my book, both as a friend and in Paula's case as a doctor, there's this sense that it's your job to look after people and you failed them. And I think that's a feeling that lots of us have in a more diffuse way about the statistics that we see in the case after case that we see, that sense that we are letting women and children down. So in my book, I've taken that feeling and sort of injected into a narrative that concerns a doctor who feels it's my job to keep my patients safe, and a friend, very, very close friends, who feel we should have known, we should have taken better care of her. What do we do now?
Yeah, and I agree. I think the reason that I used the police as a way in, and a female police officer, was that I wanted to look at, it must be just heartbreaking to work in that industry. The vicarious trauma that you get on a regular basis from coming across homicides, from going to car accidents, or from breaking up fights on the street. I can't imagine how they survive that, and then they go home to families. And that's why I gave Amelia a family, because I think that interaction between, she is quite hard and armoured up when she's at work, but when she goes home, you can actually see her softer side, and but also the intense, almost lioness-esque quality with which she wants to protect her family. So there's also that aspect of seeing all of that brutality. And even though we tend to see it more in the press, there's always this awareness at the back of our minds that we are in danger as women, that our children, our loved ones, and our friends are always in danger, because it's a prevalent crime that goes pretty well unpunished.
I love you using the word lioness, because I just think it's so interesting that for so many years, and I'm so old, I've been writing for a long time, I'm so used to any story that involves women and family and relationships between children and friends is seen as kind of small and domestic.
Yes.
And all three of these books are kind of saying, oh, it's anything but. It's sort of primal. You know, these women are goddesses and lionesses, and I love that. It's not small, it's huge.
Yes, I felt a bit uncomfortable when my book got described as a domestic thriller.
Yes, because that means small.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. Maybe what we can do, Jane, is reclaim the word domestic as a powerful word.
Yes, maybe.
Domestic lioness, or professional lioness in the Nina's kind of main characters. And speaking of that, so your three books share a common approach in that it's the main characters, some of them, are killing bad men to protect others. So it's not self-defense. We're not talking about a self-defense. It's premeditated in many ways. Some people have described it as kind of a preventative murder or avenging murders. So in your view, does it make the killing less or more justified?
More complex. Go for it.
In my book, it's not about revenge. Paula quite clearly says if these men would go to jail and be be locked away and not hurt anybody, fine. She doesn't feel any vengeful urge. It's all about, and I specifically plot it so that she has no other choice, or certainly believes she has no other choice, that there's no system that is going to give the results she needs quickly enough to save a woman and a child from being killed. So in her mind, I think it's in my book that somebody says it's preventative murder. That doesn't mean that as a reader, you don't get a little thrill of satisfaction of thinking, let's kill some of those bastards.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's morally, I don't even know how to explain this. I don't know that it's morally justified, but fiction is about giving you a sort of transgressive fantasy, a daydream of taking an urge and just running with it. Then it's certainly satisfying. And the sort of moral fire that underpins it is justified, I think.
Yes,
I agree. Sorry, you go.
I was just going to say I see it very similarly. I don't think Miriam wants to take revenge on Nick at all. In fact, she wishes he'd just go away and leave them alone.
Yep.
And as that's not possible, she has to make him go away. And however, I think she's also aware that she is, in fact, yes, she describes herself at one point, I suppose I'm a vigilante, I suppose I'm an assassin, but there's also an element of self-sacrifice because she knows what's going to happen. She doesn't try to evade responsibility for what she's done. She's prepared to pay the price, and she doesn't think that what she's done is right. She says over and over again, I've done a wrong thing. I've done a terribly wrong thing, but I've done it for the right reasons. And I think she is prepared. And the reason I think she grows as a person, or I hope she does through the book, is because she's prepared to live with the complexity of her decision. She doesn't have to justify it to herself. She just sees it as, I didn't have any other choice. I would have done anything to have another choice. She does worry that perhaps if her husband had lived longer, he might have come up with a better idea. And so she judges herself as, maybe I just could think of nothing else. But I don't, I see it almost as a sacrificial act on her part to save her children.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nina.
Yeah, I think it's difficult because my story is not told from the killer's perspective. So it's very, very late in the piece that we get any insight into what is in the killer's mind. And I don't think that her killings are particularly, their killings are particularly justified in that sense. But I'm hoping that what people will understand is where that impulse came from that shared sense and that blending of just feeling that it's a war, that it's actually a war of the sexes, and all the weaponry is on one side and all of the killings are on the other side. And I guess, so I wanted people to sort of think about what is it exactly that you're meant to do at that point. And particularly from Amelia's perspective as the thin blue line, it's supposed to keep everyone safe. And she's very well aware of how fragile that is, of how justice is something which is awarded unequally and unfairly across our community based on wealth, based on gender. And I think, so I think I wanted to look at all of that stuff, but at the end of the day and in the shakedown, I agree with Deborah. I wanted to give people that vicarious thrill of, bloody hell, what if it actually was the other way? Like, what if there was a male body count to domestic violence? Would anything be different? But I would never actually justify it.
And I think your book takes it into that domain of public policy, in that, when only 10 men have been killed, the army's brought in, whereas you have, 60 women or killed, and it's still not seen as terrorism or a national kind of crisis. And in your book, Deborah, Anita, who's the killer, says to her friend Paula, who's the GP, we just need to kill all the dangerous men. And Nina, you've got the police woman saying, if we're serious about this, we need to take it beyond law enforcement. So perhaps starting with you, Jane, like talking about, I mean, the books don't provide answers, but I think they pose questions around where do we go?
Well, of course, there are lots of things we could do to reduce the toll of domestic violence. I think it's a great idea that we're moving towards criminalising coercive control, because most of mine is about coercive control and how that works and the insidious nature of that kind of psychological and emotional abuse. And I think that it's great that we're recognising that for the first time as something insidious. But we could also, there are so many other things we could do to actually help women when they leave. Alison in the book is a privileged woman. She has somewhere to go, and she has someone who has money who can help her when she does go. But for a great many women who find themselves in abusive relationships, they have no money and they have nowhere to go. And we make a lot of pious noises about, well, you know, women should leave, you know, blah, 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 get out of this relationship. Here are the red flags, here are the signs, get out. But we actually give them nowhere to go, no safe place to go. We give them no financial resources really when they do go. So we are gaslighting as a society the women who are in these relationships, because we tell them to go with one side of our mouths. With the other side of our mouths, we do everything we can to make sure they stay. So we could look at those attitudes. And I think fundamentally we have to revisit the idea of romantic love, because I think women have been sold this ridiculous ideal of romance, getting swept off their feet. You know, what a dangerous and vulnerable position that puts you in. The whole idea of the chase, the conquest. We need to really re-examine why we sell this idea that one day this fabulous man will come and, you know, solve all the problems of your life. It's bullshit. It's never happened. And it makes us very vulnerable to those men who would misuse their power and who want to somehow own their partner and children and reduce them to kind of shadows and servants. And in a way, they're justified by some of the attitudes in our wider society. So I think there's a great many things we could do. I think the law has problems. Human relationships are complex and difficult to understand. The law is a blunt instrument. I think police have got better at dealing with domestic violence, but courts perhaps not so much. We could improve all of that, but I don't think any of them will ever be the perfect solution. It's up to us.
And Nina, I'm just thinking of the sexual harassment surveys that have come out in the last days about university, and given your role, past role in that space, you know, what do you think is going to be a solution around, you know, both for young women on campus, but broadly, as they say, across the society?
Yeah, that was awful reading those statistics, and particularly seeing ANU right up there, which, you know, in my hometown of Canberra, where I've been living for the last 20 years, I was just devastated to see the numbers of women who were being attacked, who were being harassed. Awful. And certainly, if anything, it looks like it's worse than it was, but I think that's just because we actually collect statistics on it now. My lived experience of being at university in the late 80s, early 90s was very much that sexual harassment was very prevalent, and sexual assault equally so. So I don't think that we are making the inroads that we need to. And having worked also for 20 years in government and seeing that, you know, we talk about the law being a blunt instrument, government can also be a blunt instrument and is moved in by very perverse incentives a lot of the time. And having worked particularly under this latest government and watched the funding announced, not spent, re-announced, not spent, re-announced, I'm just utterly horrified. We need to, as Jane said, and, you know, just a quick pitch, if Jane gets elected to the Senate in the next election, she'd be there actually saying this. We need to actually have some money dedicated to helping women get out, because I think that is the only real solution. So we can do all of the societal change and the cultural change. But as Jess Hill said the other day at Writers' Week, that is wishy-washy and it can move all over the place. We need that solid legislative change around coercive control. I personally think that we need to stop making sexual assault a complainant-based law. I think we need to make it the police able to step in and say, we see evidence of rape, we are going to prosecute, because until the courts start seeing the sort of numbers that we're seeing in the culture, they're not going to change. And I think we need to have really well-resourced shelters, places for women to get out and stop having, so, you know, you're concerned, Jane, about romantic love. I'm not so worried about that, but I'm really worried about the fact that we see people once they get into a relationship as a single entity. So why is the doll suddenly dropped down because two people live together, you know? And we're sort of seeing a married unit as being one thing. And as soon as it's one thing, then people are going to start power, you know, shuffling inside that. I think we need to start saying, you know, if you're an unemployed person, you get an unemployed benefit. If you're a pensioner, you get a pension. If you're an income earner, you get an income. And let's talk about the pay gap. You know, I think all those things, we need to change the way we think about men and women. We need to stop thinking about them coming together and being a unit. We need to start thinking about people as individuals and giving them their respect that they're due.
And look, it's really clear that all three of you had really researched your books. And so I guess the question is, what was the impact on you, each of you, perhaps starting with you, Debra, around, you know, getting deep into this research and living it on the, in terms of the creative process?
Like most writers, I think I have in my head at all times the sort of emotional jelly part of me that's necessary to kind of fall in love with my characters and emotionally send myself into the place they are in a certain scene. So distressed or frightened or angry or whatever, and those emotions kind of pass through my body as I'm writing it. So when you're writing about something distressing, it's distressing, but at the same time there's always this sort of icy part of you, the writer, the sort of controlling writer part of you that is watching what you're doing and controlling it, and it's some uneasy balance of those two things that makes it writable and bearable. At the end of the day, you know, you don't, I mean, sometimes there will be days when I would feel terrible, particularly when I was reading material that wasn't about me. I was reading research material. Once I was involved with my characters, I felt I had agency because I was going to decide what they did next. I didn't feel as powerless as reading a court transcript of a woman who's already dead. So some of that stuff was heartbreaking, but I think it's always the balance between those two parts of you, you know.
I think, Jane, you said it took you to a dark place writing.
Well, it did in a sense of kind of disbelief that people who start out, one presumes, with lots of hope, could end up in this appalling, destructive, terrifying situation. And indeed, at one point, I felt like I must have jumped the shark because, like Debra, I had to, the icy writer in me, and I really identify with that description, knew that I had to get Miriam to a point where you the reader, also agree she has no other choice. And so, you know, you have to ramp up the threat for that. And so at one point I thought, no, I've definitely jumped the shark here. This is too extreme. This would never happen. And I went to an old school friend of mine who's now one of Australia's top family lawyers, and I described some of the scenarios and I said, have I gone too far? And he came back and said, no, Jane, you've just summarised half the files on my desk. And I found that almost the worst moment, because it's one thing when you're writing a story that you're making up in your own head, and even though you've researched it and read judgments, and I've read, you know, books and Jess Hill's books and Talk to Survivors and all those kinds of things. It's one thing when it's an imaginary story, and it's certainly another thing when you suddenly go, oh shit, this happens in real life to real people to that extent. That was a place where I had to do some I wasn't distressed, but I was bewildered, and I suppose I was disgusted, actually, that we could get, people could behave in such a way. And that was the worst moment for me, yeah. Realising it was real.
Yeah. What about you, Nina?
Well, the research goes back quite a long way for me, in that a lot of it was lived experience that was shared with me, which I had to fictionalise quite heavily to make sure that nobody could see themselves in the book, and I really hope nobody can see themselves in the book. Yeah, it was really dark. I actually wrote it in 2017. I wrote it in the shadow of the Me Too movement, and it was inspired initially by anger. So there was a lot of that anger burning through me, and I think that kept me afloat. I was giving voice to all of these women whose stories will never be heard in a court, because there was no way they were ever going to go through that on top of what they'd been through. And I just wanted to burn out that shame that so many of them feel. I think the way that we as women are taught to take our anger and turn it inwards, where it becomes depression and shame, really breaks my heart. So I found that really energizing, using that sort of anger and leaning into Amelia's strength and to get me through that process, and that blind faith that she has that there must be a way to actually, make some kind of a difference. That got me through a lot of it, and also the relationships in the family. So giving Amelia her foster girls, that really gave me a sense of somewhere to hide in the story. So when it got too bleak, I'd go and have pizza or Chinese with the girls, and we'd light candles, and we'd decorate the house, or we'd dance around, and just to bring something back into the story of the connection and the love that I think sustains women through the shit that we often have to go through.
And we've talked a little bit already about, the responses, or the lack of responses from the justice system. But can I ask you, maybe starting with you, Deborah, and without giving away too much of the plots in each of the books, they all feature women who kill. So if you were on the jury for your characters, and they are killer characters in so many ways, would you go guilty with mitigating circumstances, or not guilty?
Well, there are certain crimes where I think you could argue self-defense. There's one in mind you go. There's one that you could argue that she is psychologically traumatized in the moment. There's one absolutely premeditated one, and I think you'd have to find her guilty. So then it's about what sentence she gets, and I think that should be very lenient. There you are.
What about you, Jane? I mean, I know there's something in your book around what happens, but, if it was you on the jury?
Well, I think I'd agree with the judge in my book.
Okay.
In fact, in some ways, I think that little paragraph of summing up is the moral heart of the book, and sums up the dilemma of everything we are struggling with. And in fact, I have a great friend who is a judge, and she went through that chapter for me and checked it all out. And her only argument was that she felt that I'd given Miriam too lenient a sentence. And in fact, the sentence is fairly harsh, I thought. So, I guess there we would differ. But I think what happens to Miriam is probably, and I think Miriam agrees, that's the correct. The law actually operated correctly in that case.
Yeah, so both Jane's and my books, the main characters know, as Jane said earlier, know that they're making a sacrifice. They know that what they're doing is wrong, and they're prepared to pay the price. That's sort of part of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And for you, Nina, it's complicated because your main character's in the police. So that, vow of, justice and all that. So what about you? Where would you put without giving it away, your perpetrator?
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting, rather than talking about that necessarily, I might lean into and be a bit cheeky and lean into a time when I was actually on a jury for a man who was on trial for shooting his father. And in that trial, during the life of that trial, the 6 weeks of evidence, which was grueling, it was never raised that he had been abused by his father, but other witnesses did come up and talk about the fact that the guy was suspected pedophile by most of the people in his community, and was, so in the jury pool room, we struggled with that quite a bit. We struggled with the notion that we felt like it might be, whilst it wasn't a justifiable homicide, he wasn't at risk at that time, he had left home, that, you know, there might be an aspect of that that should be perhaps taken into account for sentencing. But at the end of the day, when you sit on a jury, you get told very, very clearly that it is not your job to work out whether you think the person should go to jail or not. It's your job to work out whether you think the person did it. And so when it comes down to it, the person did it, the person is guilty. And when it comes to those mitigating circumstances, they exist. They exist and they are taken into account by the trial judge. And it is interesting, Jane, that your friend said that they thought it was a lenient sentence, because I wonder what they would have thought if it had been a man. If it had been a man who had committed a justifiable homicide and all of that.
We talked about that, and she went through the letter of the law, and she basically said to me, I wouldn't have much choice in the sentencing in a crime like this. This is the kind of sentence that would be given, and these are the reasons why it would be given, and it makes no difference the gender of the person. So actually, I think in that case, I decided at that point, oh, well, this is a novel, and I'm going to do what I want.
Well done, you.
Well done, you. And look, we're just about out of time, but can I have a quick response from all three of you around what your next projects are, writing or otherwise? Response. What about you, Deborah?
I'm developing The Family Doctor as a television drama, so, you know, fingers crossed, but, you know, it's a long road. I've got another television, a much sunnier project that I'm working on, another television project, and I'm in the early days of a new novel, which is neither bleak and dark nor sunny. It's a wonderful mixture of all of the above. So that's where I'm at.
And do you have an idea for a lead actor for Paula?
It's all about who's financeable. So I wouldn't mind Sarah Snook, but you know, I will take who can get it made, to be honest.
Okay, Jane, next project.
Well, I'm not thinking beyond whenever the election is, when ScoMo finally calls it, because I'm standing for the Senate for Reason Australia as the candidate for New South Wales. So I'm all systems go, busy on the campaign trail, handing out leaflets, getting donations, signing up volunteers, you know, doing social media posts about this, that, and the next thing. It's great fun. It's incredibly hard work. And to be promoting a new novel at the same time was not something I planned, but actually has worked out rather well. So, I'm tunnel vision to the end of May.
Okay. And in fact, there's a comment from a viewer. You've got my vote, Jane.
Oh, thank you.
Hopefully that person is in
New South Wales. Anyone in New South Wales can vote for me because I'm standing for the Senate. Okay.
Nina, next project.
Well, I'm at the moment learning the ropes. This is my first outing and foray as an author promoting their book. So I'm hopefully going to be doing some events and doing some stuff around that. But I've got 2 stories at the moment swirling in my head, and I'm trying to work out which way to go. So one is another story with Amelia, and the other is a different kind of thriller. So I'm not really sure, but I'm about ready to start writing. I'm just waiting to see which one lands first.
Okay. Well, it sounds like all three of you have been totally in this space for a while, and you're branching out into other things as well that are both hopefully cheerful in some ways, but also potentially dark, particularly for some of you. Jane, I don't know that I'd want Parliament House as well.
Well, the only thing I notice is they all never seem to want to leave and they keep wanting to go back.
Yes,
so it can't
they
be
do.
that bad, can it?
And let's hope that things really do significantly change, you know, those reports.
That's why I'm doing it.
Yeah, and not just in Parliament and the universities, but much more broadly. Yeah. Okay, look, that was fantastic discussion, and there's so many more questions we could be asking and that are coming through, but I think we've used up our time. But again, for all the watchers, we've got Daughters of Eve, we've got The Mother by Jane Caro, and we've got Debra Oswald's The Family Doctor. So those books, particularly Nina's book, will be out in the bookshops hopefully by this weekend. But
I know, by Tuesday.
Oh, Tuesday. Okay. So
Tuesday
they're
next week.
available, and they all complement each other in lots of ways, although they are very different to each other in other ways. So now's the point in the evening where we choose the 3 lucky ticket holders. So we've got books provided by the Sun Bookshop, which now has an online service, and they've provided 3 packages of crime novels worth $150. So what I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists to pick a number between 1 and 65, and I've got the list of who they are, and so you just randomly pick a number, and I will go down the list and announce who has won that book package. Okay, so let's start with you, Jane. Pick a number between 1 and 65.
Well, I'll pick 64 because that's how old I am.
Caroline Decosta, who is a member of Sisters in Crime. So, Caroline, you've won.
Oh, Dr. Caroline Decosta.
Yes, Dr.
Caroline.
Caroline herself.
I know Caroline well.
and famous doctor. And I know that this wasn't set up. So
no, I promise.
Oh, God. And she's got a book out, I think, about
yes, she has.
Life.
Yeah.
Life in medicine from Ireland right through to come to Australia. And I've heard her, if anyone wants to listen, it's on Conversations on the ABC, and it's
Wonderful.
fabulous.
Yeah.
She's got a novel out too.
Yes, she writes extremely well. Okay, now, Deborah, pick a number between 1 and 65 and not 64.
All right. Last week, my youngest son, this will also date me. Last week, my youngest son turned 30.
Okay, so that is Celia Gelbart. Celia Gelbart is number 30. So she gets the second package of 150 crime books, worth of crime books. All right. And then, so Nina, you're the third one.
Number 9.
Number 9 is Claire Varley. Oh, that's fantastic. Claire Varley is also a novelist and has written 2 published books and is now working on her third. She's someone that I know, actually. So congratulations to Claire. All right. So, well, those packages will be coming out to each of those people who bought tickets for tonight. So a reminder that you can buy all the 3 books that are mentioned tonight at all good bookshops, but particularly if you can patronise the Sun Bookshop, which has been incredibly supportive of Sisters in Crime over the years, turning up to events, having stalls, and then also providing the kinds of prizes that we have. Now, to let everyone know, this event will be going up on the Sisters in Crime YouTube channel, and there you will find other events similar to this, plus the Murder Monday interviews with both Australian and overseas crime writers. And so up on that YouTube channel, there's Val McDermott, Kathy Pikes, Sarah Paretsky, Anne Cleves, Louise Candlish, and Sarah Vaughan. And the other thing I'd say is for those of you who are not Sisters in Crime members, you know, shame on you. Nevertheless, welcome tonight. Very, very warm welcome. It's a terrific website with a lot of book reviews, notices about events, and hopefully more face-to-face events for the Victorians, but also for Sisters in Crime chapters around the state. You can also sign up for the monthly newsletter called A Stab in the Dark, which is one of the better titles for a newsletter, I would have to say. And you can also follow Sisters in Crime on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So again, if we can have, well, invisible Those are all clapping, all of the three authors, and thanking you for your time tonight. It's been a really rich and I think a rewarding conversation. And so everyone, stay strong, keep safe, and keep on reading, particularly books by Australian women crime writers. And keep in mind that the debut competition is going on. So if you're writers out there who published last year, you can submit your books, but also the Scarlet Stiletto short story competition. So thank you very much, and thank you to the three authors.
Thanks, Philomena.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
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 Bye.